Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Living Philosophy. In this episode, I want to talk about the Shadow Archetype, one of Jung's core archetypes of the self. But I don't just want to talk about the shadow, I want to talk about a specific aspect of the shadow, and that is the strange case of the shadow of light. And first of all, I guess a little bit about what is the shadow. So the shadow is all of the parts of yourself. So this is a part of everyone's unconsciousness, and it's the part of you which, well, Robert Bly calls it the long bag that we drag behind us, and it's all the parts of yourself that you don't express and that you suppress, because nothing in the psyche, it's like that law of thermodynamics, energy is neither created nor destroyed. It doesn't leave the closed system, and so when you suppress something, it doesn't disappear, it just goes into the unconscious, and that energy needs to be satisfied somehow, and where that goes is you're putting it into the long bag we drag behind us. Now, it's anything about yourself that you suppress, so it's not necessarily just evil and antisocial impulses, though it quite often is that. So if you think of two siblings, two young kids, or a kid and another kid, and the mother is saying, share the toys with your brother, share the toys with your sister, share the toys with your friend, and the kid is like, no, I want to do this, and then they get telling to, and the mother gives out to them, and he goes, okay, so that's not okay, I can't be like that anymore because I won't get love, and so you suppress that part of yourself that becomes selfish, something like that. And any part of yourself really can go into the shadow. What we find in the shadow is generally the antisocial kind of the instincts that do not serve us, that do not serve society rather than us necessarily. So it would conform quite a lot with Freud's conception of the id in many ways. The id is it's Latin for the it. It's the animal part of ourselves, the impulsive part of ourselves that the ego tries to repress in order to align with the superego. That's for another video. But anyway, so that's the shadow. But in this video I want to explore the idea of the shadow of light. And this is just to say that the shadow is not always what we consider evil kind of impulses. And I think it's Jung, or some Jungian that I've read has talked about the cases of criminals who would have shadows of light. So if you're living a life of an antisocial kind of life, an evil kind of, if you've identified with the darker elements of being human, then the nature of the unconscious is compensation. So why the shadow is normally dark is because our ego is normally trying to be good, we're trying to be light, and so in order to balance that, you've got the black of the yang in the unconscious to balance the yin of the white in the consciousness. But in the case of a criminal mind, or of someone who identifies with the darkness, then they've got darkness in consciousness, and what you'll find is that they've got the goodness, the traits of goodness in their unconsciousness, in their shadow. So the long bag they drag behind them is all the goodness they could have been, all the good traits that they've suppressed and said no to. And that's quite an interesting insight. And there's one of my favourite mystic philosophers is a guy called Anthony de Mello, and I'd highly recommend a book called Awareness. It's a real life-changing kind of book. It's psychology mixed with mysticism. Beautiful. So Anthony de Mello talks about this guru, this Indian guru, who told him that all the priests that come to me talk about sex, and all the prostitutes that come to me only want to talk about God. And this is the idea that we're chained to that we say no to. And so even in the case of those prostitutes that guru is talking about, you could see that idea of their shadow taking on the divinity, because they've gone so much into what we might call the profane. So is that balance, and the same with the priest, they've over-identified with the sacred, and so their shadow balances out with the profane. And so the shadow isn't fixed to be a thing of darkness necessarily, but it's it's the opposite of the ego. It balances what the ego is. And so there's a wholeness of the human being that is captured in that image, that Chinese symbol of yin and yang, the dancing, swirling light and dark, which is always breaking out into itself and into each other. And I think that that's an important thing to understand with the shadow, is that it's not fixed. And this is the way with many archetypes, and it's why it's quite hard to pin them down, because it depends so much on the context, on the individual, on the story. I'll leave you with one more story to kind of to drill that home. It's a nice story. I think I read it in Tony Robbins's Awaken the Giant Within, and it's a story of two brothers, and their father was a drug dealer and a criminal, and he went to prison. And when the boys grew up, one of them went on to become an entrepreneur and became a very wealthy man and became a very healthy man and really looked after himself. And the other one followed the path of his father and ended up getting into drugs and into drug dealing and into the underworld, and ended up in prison himself. And each of them, unbeknownst to the other, was asked, "How have you become what you are?" And both of them gave the same answer, which I quite like. They said, "Look at my father. How could I be anything else?" And obviously that's the reflection of the shadow of each. So for one, they identified with the good, and for one, they identified with the bad. And that shaped the rest of their lives. And they called it destiny, they called it fate, and yet so much of it is in our own hands, and so much of it is in our own power, if we're willing to own the darkness of our lives, if we're willing to face into our shadows in order to become whole. That's everything I have to say today on the case of the shadow of light. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, give us a like, give us a subscribe if you haven't already, and yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Give us a comment in the down below, and yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.